This church lies on the site of the early Anglo Saxon monastery of Brunanburh. Near here in the year 937, a decisive battle was fought between an alliance of invaders from Ireland and Scotland and the Saxons of Mercia and Wessex. The monastery was a modest complex of small buildings inhabited by an abbot and a dozen monks, amongst them the monk, Brother Edgar.
Brother Edgar, witness to 1,000 deaths on that dreadful day of battle. Now, 10 years have gone, but the history remains in the words of our chronicle. And what I witnessed that day differs little from the lines as written.
Herr Athelstan König, Erla Drichten, Berna Bachjeva, and his brother Ag, Admon Adeling, Aldor Langnetir, geslogen at Satcha, Swerda Ejum, Brunanburh.
Two weeks before the day of battle, a dozen longships took anchorage in Brunanburh Pool. At first, we feared this was a Viking raid, come to steal the monastery's treasures and carry off young men and girls as slaves. But there was no move against our church, and they made no attempt to breach the earthen walls enclosing the town or break down the gates. They came ashore and set up a camp of tents and fires, rounded up sheep and cattle from the local farms. So why had they come?
Brunanburh Pool was a sheltered inlet off the River Mersey. It covered the low-lying area of land just beyond where I'm standing. It was an ideal landing place and anchorage for the fleet of invading ships. The invading warriors set up camp on the higher ground to the south of the pool. In Edgar's day, this was open heath and farmland.
3 anxious days passed. The abbot, Brother Harold, and I, protected by our crucifixes, approached the camp. Brother Harold was born a Viking, but he came from a peaceful settlement to the north of Brunanburh. All there now Christian, all there now Mercian. But Norse was their language. We came before their leader. It was Anlaf, the King of Dublin, a fearsome warlord. He taunted us by saying not a word, gave no answers to Harold's questions. Thus, we learned nothing of this invader's plans, and came away in no less fear or terror. Edwin, Thane of Brunanburh, sent out messengers across the lands of Mercia and Wessex. At Winchester, our King Athelstan would be told Anlaf, his most hated foe, was on Saxon land.
Thane Edwin was responsible for the organisation of local government, including the defence of Brunanburh. The settlement was enclosed by an earthen bank to give some protection. But this would have been inadequate against the large band of warriors that landed at Brunanburh Pool. Brunanburh was, though, well connected to other centres of population by the network of Roman roads. Messages could be carried great distances at impressive speeds by messengers on horseback. News of the invasion reached Athelstan at Winchester in less than 4 days.
During the long days that followed the arrival of Anlaf's ships, fear ate at our uncertain souls, causing a deep anxiety that our prayers could not assuage. Then more ships came, more warriors, more fires burned through the night, more animals taken from our farms with impunity. More ships came, ships from Scotland. King Constantine was here, someone said, the ageing leader of the Scots, revered by his own people and feared by his foes. I was sent to the Roman bridge that crossed the Dibben to look upon the ships drawn up along the shore. How many ships had come was the question. 70 was my answer. Thane Edwin said 2,000 men at least. But we have more. And Athelstan is here. Men of Wessex and Mercia have gathered to the south, keeping hidden their strength of numbers.
The area where the battle would take place was typical of a battleground of the Middle Ages. The flanks of each army protected by natural landscape features. At one end, the River Mersey. At the other, the steep-sided valley of the River Dibben. Anlaf and Constantine, each with a small band of personal guards, were positioned well behind their warriors, ensuring there was an escape route if the battle didn't go in their favour. Athelstan had the protection of a small group of cavalry. Although the Saxons had a good proportion of mounted men, they would fight on foot, as was the custom of the day.
The abbot, his monks, those too young to fight, and women, some with babies in their arms, stood on top of Brunanburh's encircling earthen walls, eyes turned towards the newly risen sun. Two lines of warriors in a deadly confrontation, 100 paces apart. Along each line, shields overlap shields, as if a solid wall. Thane Edwin was somewhere in their midst. His wife was sick with an anxiety beyond measure. I uttered a hopeful prayer that God's providence would grant this day as ours.
There was little subtlety in a medieval battle. The victorious side would be the side that succeeded in breaking through the other side's line of warriors. Having a second or third line of men, especially in the centre, allowed for replacement of fallen warriors, but more importantly, it gave extra power in what was simply a trial of strength.
Two sides came together with a sickening crash of shield against shield and deafening shouts that cursed, entwined with screams of pain and death. Soon came the answer to my prayer. A child at my side, with the clear eyes of youth, shouted above the battle's din, "The Saxons are through!" Half a mile distant from where we stood, the invaders' line had given way. God was on our side that day.
The battle was all but lost for the Scots and Irish when their shield wall was breached. They could now be attacked both from the front and from behind. The invaders who were near to where this had happened had no choice but to stand and fight. Those further away fled the battlefield in blind panic, scrambling down the steep banks of the Dibben, trying to get to safety.
I saw from my vantage point a horde of hateful Scots and Irish men pouring down the steep Dibben's banks. If they gained the other side by the ford, they might outrun our Saxon men and live.
The road bridge at the bottom of this hill marks the position of the ford over the River Dibben, the only crossing point for those fleeing the battlefield. From here there were two tracks the warriors could take, both leading deeper into Mercian territory, so there was little prospect of anyone escaping the pursuing Saxons. The track that now lies under this modern road was a very steep hill to climb for those already exhausted by the fighting and weighed down by armour and weapons.
An hour was to pass before the killing on the battleground was done. Then those Saxons who were horsemen returned from the field to their mounts to ride in pursuit of those who had fled. If hate is a sin, then on that day I sinned through my hatred for these invaders. For surely in the eyes of God, they are only men like us. For this, I beg heaven for forgiveness. But not so for my despising of Anlaf and Constantine, who, when the battle was lost, cared naught for the men who had followed them, only for themselves. 7 ships I saw row into the river, then with hoisted sails head for the Irish Sea. Anlaf and Constantine had escaped unscathed. I had now seen enough of death and sorrow. I turned my back on the field of death and returned to the sanctuary of the monastery.
The battlefield on which hundreds died is now buried under buildings and tarmac. Those who come here to do their shopping line up their parked cars as if mimicking the shield walls of the long-forgotten warriors. And they know nothing of the blood that was spilled on the land beneath their feet.
After many years it is with me still, the vision of hell greeting us on the day that followed. At dawn, I went to look upon the battlefield. With me, the abbot, all the other monks, the women and children of Brunanburh, Thane Edwin's wife. Was Edwin dead or alive? She didn't know. The Mercian and Wessex warriors had started work, digging graves for those of nobility who had fallen. Brave Edwin was amongst them, his body mutilated by sword and axe. For the other dead, the common soldiers, Irish, Scots, and Saxon men, they were left to lie on the blood-soaked ground. Prayers for their souls were said. Then we monks moved on.
After the battlefield dead had been stripped of their weapons, the local people took what remained: clothes and shoes, belts and buckles.
We crossed the ford, my brother monks and I, where more dead men lay. We then walked towards the west, along a track festooned with death. Men cut down without mercy by the swords of Saxon horsemen. Onward we sorrowful monks trudged, following the trail of death, across heath and field, till no more bodies lay at our feet, no more stench of death, or cruel buzz of flies, just the sound of singing birds. God's land here was in peaceful rest.
After a day or two, the bodies that littered the farmland and settlements were reduced to skeletons by scavenging animals, unrecognisable as friend or foe. These remains were buried by the local people, thrown into disused clay pits and covered with soil or turf. Or, if no convenient pit was available, a shallow mass grave was dug.
Now, on the silent battlefield, where hundreds died, and beyond the Dibbins Ford, where the greater slaughter scarred the land with blood and death. Herdsmen sought the cows and sheep that survived the invaders' butchery, fires and feasts. The abandoned ships of Brunanburh were set to fire and sent towards the Irish Sea on an ebbing tide.
Within a few weeks, the battlefield returned to how it was before the invasion, heath and farmland, and the landscape remained as such until the coming of industry in the early 20th century. However, not much has changed in the place where the Saxon horsemen caught up with the last of the fleeing warriors. Apart from the motorway, this landscape has remained relatively unscathed.
The battle now is 10 years past. Each day I offer prayers at the war graves of the fallen nobles. A grass-covered mound marks their resting place. At Athelstan's command, a carved stone cross was erected on this low green hill. As the years go by, more wild flowers appear, and yet this remains a lonely place. Nearby runs the wide, cold, grey river, on which our God's sun rarely deems to shine.
The cross marking the resting place of the fallen Saxon nobles was torn down on the orders of the Norman Earl of Chester following the Battle of Hastings in 1066. This was long after the death of Edgar and the others who had witnessed the Battle of Brunanburh. But the Wargrave site was still a special place for the generations of monks who followed, and the broken stones of the cross were carried to the safety of the monastery. Hardly any of the key landscape features associated with the battle have survived the onslaught of commercial and domestic development. It is still possible, however, to identify on a modern Ordnance Survey map where the two armies met in battle. The Brunanburh that Brother Edgar knew has long since vanished. Of course, he wasn't to know that everything would change so dramatically in the 1,000 years that followed his death. He would go to his grave believing the stone cross would stand as a memorial until Judgment Day. Although the cross had been broken up and removed, the Wargrave site remained recognisable right up until the early 20th century and was marked on early editions of the Ordnance Survey map. but it now lies under a commercial unit on the left-hand side of this road.
When my soul has long ago departed this cruel, war-torn world, when my bones lie rotting in the earth, the stone cross will still stand, no doubt worn more smooth by the cold winter winds and driven rain, but here still, to remind the countless generations who follow after me of the great battle fought near Brunanburh.
Athelstan's cross was reconstructed in 1958 from fragments that had lain inside the church for as long as people could remember. The broken pieces carried from the war grave site on the battlefield had somehow survived the destruction of the monastery during the reign of Henry VIII. The cross is a lasting memorial to the battle fought near Brunanburh.